Well, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for the virtual tour brought to you by Region 9 and the Kemp Center for the Arts with support from the Pretty Foundation. Today, we head to the Whiteside Museum in Seymour to catch up with paleontologist Christopher Fleiss, where we will discuss a creature that was named for the town. It was discovered in, that is, the Seymoria. We're going to take a look at a little information about that right now.
The creatures we're going to talk about today lived 280 million years ago. Now that's a lot of years to think about. So to help you understand how long ago that is, we're going to time travel by walking back in time, and each step will take us 100 years into the past. So with one step, 100 years ago, we're back in the middle of World War I. Within 3 steps, 300 years, the USA doesn't exist as a country, but pilgrims are starting to check it out. In 20 steps, will you have even made it out of the room you're in yet? 2,000 years ago, we are in the time of Jesus. In 45 steps, 4,500 years ago, the pyramids are just being built. In 55 steps, 5,500 years ago, people are just beginning to invent writing. This is a picture of a cuneiform, one of the oldest known forms of writing. Imagine having to use this to do your homework. In 2,000 steps, that's just about 1 mile. 200,000 years ago, Homo sapiens are just beginning to walk the earth. In 6,000 steps, or just 3 miles, 600,000 years ago, the Yellowstone caldera is forming. This is what causes all the hot springs and geysers in Yellowstone to erupt. In 50,000 steps, or 25 miles, we've just crossed the border into Oklahoma. 5 million years ago, the Grand Canyon is forming. In 830,000 steps, or 415 miles, 83 million years ago, we finally walked to the time of the Tyrannosaurus Rex. In 2,500,000 steps, or 250 million years ago, to 95% of life on Earth is wiped out in a mass extinction. And we finally arrived 2,800,000 steps, or 280 million years ago, and we're in the Permian era, checking out Seymoria. It's like walking from Wichita Falls to Toronto, Canada. A journey like that would mean walking 20 miles a day for 70 days.
Amazing amount of steps there. Our anchor and reporter Daryl Franklin here at KFDX Television had the chance to go and visit the Whiteside Museum 2 years ago. Here's what he learned.
These are the animals common to Seymour and Baylor County. They're native here, and many more of them used to be.
This is the first glimpse of big land walking life on the planet, and everything that scientists really know about the first big land walking life are because of the fossils that are right here in Baylor County and essentially right around Seymour, Texas.
34-year-old Chris Fleiss has been digging up fossils just about his entire life, and at this dig site in Baylor County, he and his team find new fossils of prehistoric animals every year, some that are even completely new to science.
Yeah, this is so fun. So I was the first human being to ever see this bone, ever. In the history of every human being, I was the first one to ever see it. It covered most of North America.
About 287 to 290 million years ago, Fleiss says this part of Texas was much closer to the equator, and it was full of ponds, lakes, and swamps, perfect for preserving pre-dinosaurs, like the meat-eating Dimetrodon.
This time in the Permian, this is the biggest animal on the planet. I mean, there's nothing bigger than this. Here is the right face of a huge Dimetrodon. And these are the teeth right here sticking out. Some very large teeth.
Oh, it's really exciting, especially when you start with one bone and then you're digging and then you find another and another all together, and you're like, oh my gosh, the whole thing's here.
Lee Cook's also a paleontologist who's returned with Fleiss to this site for years, a site that's changed very little since Charles Sternberg first made famous pre-dinosaur discoveries right here in the late 1800s.
I think there's a responsibility to tell their story.
And one of the great things about digging at this level, in the sort of bowl that we're in right now, is just how well preserved these fossils really are that can be prepared for research and exhibit just 5 miles away in Seymour at the Whiteside Museum of Natural History.
This is a truly, and I don't exaggerate, world-class lab.
And renowned paleontologist Dr. Robert Bacher says there's no better place than the Texas red beds to study paleoecology, using not only the animals' remains, but also the other animals and plants they ate to learn more about the environment they lived in.
Like wildlife ecologists, we want to watch Euryalps as it swims through the swamp, ambushing Edaphosaurus. We want to watch the baby Dimetrodon moving through the forest and keeping out of the way of the adult Dimetrodon.
Not too many Seymourias have ever been found, really. The very first one was 1882, Charles Sternberg. And it wasn't named Seymour until 1901-ish.
And Fliss says the Seymoria, named for the town near the site where its remains were found, is an important link that separates the amphibian group from the reptile group.
You never know when you're going to run into a bone or something.
There were also freshwater sharks here that lived in bodies of water that dotted the landscape then.
This is essentially a venomous spine, very similar to the tail spine on a stingray.
And one of the very first big plant-eating animals was the Diadectes.
He's also one of the very first big land-walking animals that has hearing, which is interesting. Hearing is a very new thing in the Permian or for animals in general.
But along with pre-dinosaurs on display here in Baylor County, because their fossils are not found better intact anywhere in the world, Chris says this museum would not be complete without dinosaurs that came much later.
We have reptiles and amphibians where we're digging, and eventually our reptiles are going to branch off and we'll start to see the first animals that lead to dinosaurs. So without the animals right here in Seymour, all of your favorite dinosaurs would not be here, period.
Nor would the animals of today. Those who visit the museum will see the lizards of today are not much different from those 300 million years ago, other than size.
When you have something that works, it doesn't change at all.
Here, visitors can walk right up to scientists and see how bones older than those of dinosaurs are freed from 285 million years of geological glue before they're slowly pieced back together.
These are parts of her spinal column, so those are the vertebrae that actually comes out the back of the skull there. So that's her neck essentially starting.
When you walk through the doors of the Whiteside Museum of Natural History, you become a time traveler, going from today back 1 million, 100 million, even 300 million years of animal history.
Fascinating, Daryl. Thank you very much. Let's go to Seymour. Good afternoon, Mr. Fleiss. Thank you for joining us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'm delighted to be with you guys today.
We really appreciate it. Perhaps you could share a little bit of information about the Permian era, but before even that, tell us how you got interested in paleontology.
Yeah, so I grew up as a dino digger, actually, with my dad, probably about 5 years old when I found my first dinosaur. And he's a geologist, retired, and so instead of going to movie theaters and Little League, I went out to the middle of nowhere and picked up dinosaur bones. So now I'm here in Seymour collecting the fossils that I grew up loving and bringing them to you guys so the world can see the really amazing fossils right here in Baylor County.
Really fun. Thank you very much. So talk more about the Permian era. Are you drawn to that as opposed to the more famous T-Rex?
Oh my goodness, yes, the Permian is such a fun time. We're looking at a time well before the dinosaurs, the things that we are well known for in North America because of pop culture, T-Rex and all these big guys. But the Permian, 287 million years, 60 million years before the first dinosaurs. These are the guys that are going to lead the first terrestrial animals, the first animals walking on the planet. Start with these guys right here in Baylor County with the very first reptiles and the very first amphibians. The things that are the predecessors to most of the animals that we are familiar with today is because a lot of these critters that we dig up right here in Baylor County. This is the best place in the world to study the very first animals that are walking on land before the dinosaurs.
Well, while you answer this next question, we have some video that we're going to show drone footage from our sister station in Dallas, KXAS. But you mentioned Baylor County.
Okay.
Well, Baylor County is pretty big, and you're at a tiny little spot there. How do you know where to go and dig?
So as a scientist, there's a couple different things that we do to find fossils. The first thing is having a really good knowledge of the dirt. So if you know how to read the dirt like a book, then you can figure out where to look for fossils. So if you take dirt next to a river and compare it next to a beach or even next to a pond, all the dirt is going to be different wherever you go. So if you can figure out what dirt represents the ecosystem that animals like best, then you can figure out which dirt to look for. So for the sites that we dig, we look for soils that represent old ponds or watering holes. Essentially, this is where animals go for life. Let's look at the Serengeti today. We have lions and gazelles and alligators all come to a single watering hole every season to live, to die, to breed, and that's their ecosystem. So for our dig sites here, we look for that source of life, the watering holes. And so we have extinct ponds that had season after season of muds and rains where these animals would come back and forth and live and die and breed. And we have a wonderful story preserved in those layers. Essentially, we read those layers just like it's a book, but we specifically look for those kind of soils that those fossils are going to be most likely found in.
That is fascinating. So obviously the dinosaurs can't tell you why they went to a particular place, but you know they had to get water at some point, and it makes sense to go and look near some sort of a water source or a pond. What is the difference?
You betcha.
Go down even closer. So there's a pond. Are bones all around this area? And what in the dirt are you looking for? Let me back up. Flesh out more. I'm fascinated by this. Flesh out more exactly why the dirt in now a dry area tells you that it used to have a pond there.
Okay, so when we look at the soils, and if you guys can see this beautiful big skeleton of Bonnie the Dimetrodon, she's buried in the very classic red beds of north central Texas. And these red beds are a very fine silty mud, essentially a silty mudstone. And so these silts slowly settle on the bottom of the pond and become very dense. And so when we are digging through those really dense clays, we're seeing the succession of the bodies that slowly settle to the bottom of the pond. And so that's what we look for, is these very dense clays, and that's the evidence of these animals being very slowly swept in and preserved on the bottom of these old ecosystems.
So then you find a spot that looks okay. Sometimes do you just start digging and not find anything and have to go to another spot?
You know, sometimes you just start digging blindly and you get lucky, which we have done many, many times. But for the most part, you know, essentially we could toss a rock in Baylor County and a little bit beyond, and you're in the right place to find fossils. For us, we get a little more specific than that, but the whole area is ripe for really incredible Permian age fossils. And it's because this part of the world is the best place in the world to study these guys, and that's because the sediments have the right kinds of minerals and conditions to preserve bones and fossils very, very well. It's unlike anywhere else on the planet.
Fascinating. Totally fascinating. Now, from the pictures, it didn't look like you really had to dig down that far. What's going on there?
That's right. So we are essentially finding fossils on the surface of the ground. So if we go back 287 million years, after these guys die, lots of sediments are going to be accumulating on top of the ground. And eventually, these animals are going to be preserved in the blocks of dirt. And then if we go forward millions and millions of years, lots of weathering processes occur. Mother Nature starts to strip away the dirt through natural processes like oceans and wind and other things like that. And so all the sediments that are above them slowly get eroded away to expose the surface of where these animals were. These dense clays are so hard that they have a harder time to erode. And so we have evidence of all these bits and pieces of these animals that make up the story for all the animals that were living in this area over, we could probably guess, thousands of years or the lifetime of this small ecosystem at a single dig site.
So let's go to the mechanics of it then. You find a spot, you say, hey, that looks good. What kind of tools are you going to use?
Well, we use our toothbrushes, so we've got lots and lots of tools. Let's go back over this way. We'll show you the tools that we use that Miss Sandy's actually working on here. So our favorite tools are these little guys right here. This is what we dig up an entire fossil with. So even a 3,000-pound block of bones, this is what we dig our tools with. A very small pick with a very sharp needle. We do that because we don't want to break anything. And then when we get those big blocks into the museum, this is our next favorite tool. It's a Q-tip. So if you can see that, we use thousands upon thousands of Q-tips and very slowly clean the bones so that we don't break anything. But one of my most favorite quotes is from an old paleontologist in the 1880s, and he said that if anybody ever asks you to help him dig up a dinosaur, he might not be your friend because it's a lot of work. And so this is what he's talking about. When you think about digging up dinosaurs, this is what the tool is that you're using to dig up an entire dinosaur or pre-dinosaur.
Well, that's perfect timing for you to say that, because we're actually showing some video of somebody working in a very small spot with very small tools, but we're actually showing it like a time lapse. It's sped up. You must just have incredible patience for this.
Yeah, so those bones are absolutely in beautiful condition, but we do things very slowly. Yep, that's one of my volunteers using a dental pick to slowly clean off what we call a Varaniosaur femur. So Varaniosaurus was a really cool little reptile that lived right at the same time as all these guys, 290 million years ago. And so that bone is just nestled nicely on a flat plane that shows you that it settled to the bottom of that mud. And so now Tracy there is using a pick to slowly clean off the clays around it. And in a second you'll see him brush it off and take it out. And essentially that bone is already cleaned. There's not much more we need to do to it. And this is one of the reasons why Baylor County is one of the best places in the world to study these bones, is because the preservation is absolutely incredible.
Well, you mentioned a volunteer. How does that work, please? Now, if you find somebody who's not a, type A personality, who has the patience to maybe do this kind of work, is that something that somebody could pursue, to come and volunteer with you?
Yeah, this is a profession that is good for anybody who likes to play in the dirt. You don't need to know what you're doing to start something like this. If you've played in the dirt as a kid, you've already passed the prereqs there. So a lot of my volunteers have no science background or very little science background, and they come into the museum and they learn how to clean and prep these fossils with us, and they all become professionals right away. Miss Sandy here has been cleaning fossils now for us for 3 years, and she's a retired school teacher, and she is an incredible fossil prep technician now. She loves it, and comes in almost every day just to clean these bones that are essentially the very first inhabitants of her own backyard here 290 million years ago.
I have a note here that says that sometimes you'll get to a site and there are multiple skeletons, and you have to make some decisions as to what you're going to do. There's something called plastering. Maybe you could explain that. And then how do you decide where to dig and where not to dig?
Yeah, so I guess the best way to start that, so when we find a block of bones, we have no idea how many bones are there. That's the fun part. And so what we do, and let's take a look at this block here. This is a block of an amphibian skull called Trematops, another really cool guy. And next to the Trematops is a baby Dimetrodon, which is a little fin-backed guy. This is our famous carnivore with the fin of the sail. And so we had no idea these two guys were together. And if you look at the shape of this block, it's not a straight shape. It changes directions all the time. So when we're digging very slowly, we have to trench around this block of bones and carefully work our way around these extra bones that we keep finding. It makes the shape change automatically. So we have to kind of decide when and where to stop digging just to get out a single block of bones. So if we can find enough space between those bones to make a little bit of room to take that block out, we will. It's a lot of fun seeing a 5,000-pound block in a museum, but we don't want to have to do that if we don't have to. If we can take it out in a smaller block, that's a lot better. But for things like this, when it really makes an incredible education display to show you how incredibly abundant the bones are, how impressive they are as they're cleaned. This is really just such a historic thing for the community to see that they are living in one of the best bone beds in the entire world for fossils of these age animals. Not a lot of people realize that. And just the density and the biomass, all the animals that were here are just right here in their own backyard.
You've mentioned that a couple of times, that we're obviously blessed to be in a spot here that has some amazing skeletons. Before you answer that question, we're showing some video in the field of plastering. Flesh that out a little bit more for us.
Oh, yeah. Yep. So this is when we are plastering a 5,000-pound block of Dimetrodon bones, and this is a kind of fun shot because this is in winter and we are freezing our tails off right now in that picture. But we are got our hands wet and we are putting plaster on this giant block in 20 degrees. But that's what you got to do. So we've already trenched around that block of bones, and now we're coating it in plaster and burlap and making it very thick. So once that's dry, that took about a week because it was so cold, we would take a tractor, flip that block over, and then bring it into the museum. So it's all contained in one giant block.
Wow. So the plastering is to what, stabilize that area that you've dug so that you can move it?
That's right. So when we want to keep all those bones together so they don't fall apart, we don't know what else is in that block. So we don't want to take those bones out until we can have it somewhere where we can work nice and slowly. So there could be something in between the bones or underneath. So the objective there is to take as much of that soil as you can so that you can make sure you don't miss anything at all and also preserve the bones themselves.
What's the biggest block that you've pulled out of Baylor County?
The biggest block we pulled out was about 8,000 pounds, and that was the Bonnie block, which is a really beautiful, complete Dimetrodon skeleton, and that took a lot of moving with big earth-moving tractors and things like that. So 8,000 pounds for Baylor County is a big one.
Wow. So 8,000 pounds is how many feet by how many feet?
She is actually right here. So Bonnie is about 7 feet wide by about 6 feet across. And this is just looking at the process of now that it's been cleaned. So when we first found her and we got her block out, the block actually came up to about here. So she was about 4 feet thick. So if you can imagine 4 feet thick of sediments in one giant block. And over the course of about 8 months now, we've slowly cleaned off all the sediments and exposed Bonnie. So now you can see Bonnie's fin and her backbone and all of her ribs. And so that's the next stage. But originally, this block was very, very thick and very big.
I see it now that we saw the plastering video. So that was a whole big chunk, and you've been taking out little bits and pieces of that. But around the edge, that's the white, that's the plaster.
That's right.
I got it. You've mentioned a couple of times.
Yep. So that's the plaster on the outside, and that's what's containing the entire block of dirt.
Got it. You've mentioned a couple of times that this is just a fantastic place in all the world to look for bones and fossils. Tell me some of the other places that aren't as lucky as us,
That's
but
right.
maybe in the top 5 or something.
Well, we are very lucky, absolutely. So Oklahoma's got some pretty good Permian beds as well, definitely not as good as ours. Germany has some pretty famous beds, and South Africa also has some very good fossil beds. But when going with the abundancy, the preservation, the diversity, all those things calculating together, we really have top-notch, one of the best places in the world to study specific faunas, types of animals, the different species, the evolution of ecosystems and things like that. It's the bigger picture that's all together for our county that is really shows that we have an incredible resource to look at how life was evolving 290 million years ago.
So how much is there? You got another year's work, or is this another 10 years' work, 50, 100 years?
We'll be here as long as paleontologists still have jobs and working and digging. We will be here for hundreds and hundreds of years.
Wow.
The very first bones came out of this county in about 1875. And, probably less than 1% today has been taken out of that quarry, out of this area.
Wow.
So scientists will be visiting this area for lifetimes and lifetimes.
So give us an idea of the timeline. You find a spot, you say, hey, there's some bones there, and then you're going to go through the digging process and a plastering process and bringing it back to the museum. How long does that take? Is it a day, a month, a week?
Yeah, it all depends on what it is. So for something like Bonnie, we found Bonnie in 2016, and it took us almost a full year to get that block out of the ground. It was that much work to dig with the small dental picks and then come back when the weather was good enough to do this. So a big block like this can take a year just to get into the museum. This one is the Abby skeleton. Abby is another Dimetrodon that we got out just recently, and it took about 6 months to get her out, and she weighed about 3,000 pounds. So that's another big one. And you can see her beautiful skull right there with all of her teeth. So this one's about 6 months. The nice thing, and this goes back to your question about why we like these guys instead of dinosaurs, all the animals at this time period were about as big as I would say a cow or something like that. Nothing bigger than that. So you're not digging out 10-ton Triceratops here, which takes years and years and years. We've got little things that come up much more quicker, but ultimately it's still a lot of work.
Got it. I've got a couple more questions, but also just a little housekeeping, how this will work. We have
Sure.
some schools online, and there may be some technical difficulties, but I want to give the schools an opportunity in just a second after I ask the next question to let them ask a question. The way it'll work, Mr. Fliss, is that they'll ask me, so there'll be a bit of silence for you, and I will relay the question for you. But my next question comes with regard to working on these bones, and it's very delicate work, as you said, but what happens if you break one of these things? Are they easy to break, and what do you do if you do?
We break them all the time. You cannot do this job without breaking bones, and so, that's why God made super glue. So we've got super glue. But we break things all the time and put things back together. If you'll notice the skeleton right here, you'll see that we're cleaning this parts of the bone. You'll see little wet spots here, and those are some of the adhesives that we use to stabilize a lot of these bones. They've been here for almost 300 million years, so they're not going to be in much worse shape than they were 50 million years ago. But we do as much as we can to keep the bone stabilized, and breaking things is not unusual. That's just part of the process of learning how to keep things in good shape and put them back together.
Wow. All right, I have a list of schools, and again, we may have some technical difficulties, but if you'll bear with me a minute, let me just check with Iowa Park. Iowa Park first, and then second will be Burke Burnett, so you can get ready in Burke. But Iowa Park, is there anybody there with a question? I'll give them just a moment or two. Okay, they're telling me nothing from Iowa Park. So Burke Burnett would be next, followed by City View. Anybody in Burke? We have Vernon. Okay, let's try Vernon. Hi, Vernon. Anybody in Vernon have a question for Mr. Fliss? And I'll give them one more shot. Again, this is a bit of a technical leap here, so they may have some difficulty. But if anybody has a question in Vernon, you can answer that now. Okay. I'm told they're going to try and do it on a chat. There's no microphone there, so we may do that in just a minute, Mr. Fliss.
Okay.
Excuse me. Let's shift to the actual product to you guys. How do you get to this point if you are just like you from a young age with your father digging up bones and rocks? If somebody is interested in working in this field, what kind of training does it take? Or do you even just working in the lab? Well, let's say if you want to train in this, let's answer that, or ask that question first.
So if you want to go the academic route, which is the way I went as well, and, I was very specific on what I liked and I wanted to do with my life and be very passionate about something. So I stuck with it. I was a big fan of animals and dinosaurs, and I wanted to be in the biology field my entire life. I was in love with nature, so I stuck with my passions, going to school and taking a lot of geology and biology. And ultimately getting my first job at a museum. And ever since, I would always work with museums to get as close to my passion as I could. But definitely, if you go the academic route, it's just stay with the classes and stuff like that. That is really good for your focus. With me, it was animals and biology and geology for the fossils. Like I said, if you want to volunteer for things like this, museums are never in lack of volunteers. We always need volunteers. So that's something that you can train for with having no experience at all. So it kind of depends on how passionate you are about something like that.
Tell us about your week. In a given week or maybe a month, how much time are you out in the field?
If I'm not doing tours in the museum, I'm usually out in the field in the afternoon. So we're out in the field pretty much every day of the year that we can be. February gets kind of cold sometimes, so we try not to do it in the sub-zero temperatures. And of course, the summer can be very brutal in the afternoons. So, but for the most part, we are fighting the elements as often as we can by getting out in the field and looking and searching for new fossils all the time.
So on cold mornings in February, you're doing some tours. If anybody wants to learn more about that, how can they do that?
Yeah, we are always giving tours in the museum. So you can always give a call to the museum and let them know that you want a guided tour of the museum, and we're more than happy to do that anytime.
And then we mentioned briefly a short time ago the volunteers, but if somebody wants to get more involved in that or learn more, how would you direct them?
I highly encourage anybody who has an interest in science and biology and paleontology, zoology, anything in the science field, to come and see me about volunteering with the museum. There's always somewhere for volunteers to learn new things, whether it's cleaning fossils, taking care of the live animal exhibits, and just learning about all the native animals here in Texas. There's always something for you to learn here. So I highly encourage anybody that's interested to come and see us, and we'll be glad to show you how to do some stuff.
Now wait, it's not just bones, there are live animals?
You bet, yep. So I was, like I said, I'm a big fan of live animals. So yeah, let's walk over to the... I grew up picking up snakes and frogs and lizards and all the usual creepy crawlies that Mom doesn't like us to do, you know. But like I said, when you're passionate about something, you never stop. And so now I have my own little mini zoo here in the museum, which is great for us because we like to show the comparisons of the animals that are today and where they came from. A lot of these animals have their roots right here in Seymour 290 million years ago. The lizards, like these guys, their distant cousins appeared right here in Seymour, you know, almost 300 million years ago. So showing the comparisons of the past tells us so much about our future as well. And it doesn't have to do with just reptiles. It can be the insects and the arachnids and even the mammals. Everybody that we know today has some sort of root connection to right here in Seymour.
And those are available for tours. What are the hours of the museum?
You bet. So we're open every day of the week except for Mondays. And it's 10 to 4 every day of the week.
Very good. Now, I want to ask you maybe more of a pop culture question. I always give the example. Now, I'll look at the movie
Sure.
Twister, because I'm the weatherman here. I'll look at the movie Twister and go, yeah, that's not quite right. Do you do the same thing for Jurassic Park?
Oh my gosh, love-hate relationship. You know, Dr. Robert Bacher, who's a good friend of mine, and still we write papers as well. He was consulted on the movie, and he loved working with Spielberg in this. I mean, it's a wonderful movie. As a kid, you absolutely love dinosaurs, and it's a great dinosaur movie. But of course, there's a lot wrong that because it's a fiction. So as a scientist, I hated it. As a kid, and it's still the kid in me, I love it. So it's awesome.
Now, I can't remember which one, but I feel like in my memory there's some movie where somebody playing a paleontologist picks up a little bit of dirt and puts it in his mouth and goes and figures something out. Have you ever put dirt in your mouth?
We eat dirt all the time. Dirt can tell you the grain size. Okay, so that's why we do it. We look to see the grain size. So if we're looking for sandy sediments, we'll feel the sand on our tongue. If we're looking for silty sediments, muddy sediments, it'll be really soft. So yeah, we're not crazy. We're doing it for a reason, not for health reasons or anything like that. But we do eat dirt all the time.
All right, let's bridge the gap then in between the live animals and the bones. You guys make a lot of, I don't want to say assumptions, but maybe conclusions is a better word, by looking at these bones about what the animals looked like, what their skin was like. How do you make that jump?
That's right. So really you start with the bones. And so when you have a good idea of what an animal looks like today, you can compare bones with animals back then and have a pretty good plan on what they would have looked like. When you get towards colors and things like that, that's where it gets kind of tricky. So today we base off really good interpretations of what an animal looks like by what their relatives are doing today in the ecosystem. So if you go out to the desert here in Seymour, you'll see a lot of the snakes and the lizards. They're all pretty specific colors, very dull browns and sand colors. They're blending in for their ecosystem pretty well. You'll notice that everything on the planet, even back then, was built for their ecosystem specifically. So an animal in the rainforest, you see lots of colors, things that blend in with their surroundings. You'll see animals in the desert that are blending in with the sands and stuff like that. And then you can split it into carnivores and herbivores. So take Dimetrodon, for example, there. Dimetrodon is going to have a really big sail on his back. And typically the males and the females are going to be different colors. So we can guess that the males will probably be more brightly colored than the females. So we use a lot of these little rules to kind of guide us to what we think they would look like. And that's where the artist's interpretations come in. The very first dinosaurs with feathers were drawn in 1969 with Dr. Robert Bacher. The theories of what they looked like was starting to come to fruition. And so the artist renditions, that's the biggest thing that helps to show people what they look like. Big ones like this.
So that's interesting. You're taking clues from today. Like you said that, for example, females might be more brightly colored than males. We see that today, so you're kind of projecting that backwards. Is that correct?
Absolutely, yep. The males are typically more brightly colored than the females, so they can attract mates. All the men want to look real pretty. It's a little bit different than today, but we know that this is how it works. You want to make yourself get noticed really quickly. So the colors are probably a really good guess for a lot of these animals. And again, based on the ecosystems they live in. So there is a little bit of rhyme to the reason of why we have theories on what they look like, and I think we're pretty accurate on it.
You've mentioned the word ecosystem a couple of times. So you've obviously got the bones for the animals, but plants and habitat, you make some assumptions, I guess, from fossils as well, right?
Yeah, we're going to look at some fossil plants, actually. Let's come right over here. This adds to the story of what these ecosystems look like. You've got the bones, so you know what animals were there, but how about the plants that they were eating, the things that the herbivores were eating? So here's another great example of some of the incredible fossils from this county. These are some of the fossilized ferns and conifers found right here in the county. These are the things that the plants that the herbivores were eating. So at this time, 287 million years ago, all we had were ferns and conifers. That's about it. We didn't have flowering plants. We didn't have the things that are associated with flowers, like bees, things that pollinate. Right now, we just have the ferns and conifers. And if you take a look at the northwest, you see that kind of an ecosystem today in the Oregon area with lots of ferns, lots of conifers, lots of pine trees. That's a pretty good example of what this area would have looked like. So you add the swamps and you add the really high temperatures as well. That's kind of painting that picture of what the ecosystem looked like. A good example would also be a Louisiana swamp. So if you mix in the ferns and the conifers into a Louisiana swamp, that's a pretty good idea.
We've had a pretty stable, iconic view of a T-Rex for a number of years, but now I am told that maybe there's talk of feathers?
Oh, my goodness. So feathers on dinosaurs, that is not a new theory. That's been around for a long time. The very first time anybody ever suggested that dinosaurs and birds were related was about 1859 with Thomas Henry Huxley. It was right after Darwin's Evolution of Species theories came out, and Huxley saw some incredible similarities, uncanny similarities between a dinosaur skeleton and a bird. And so now we go up to 1969 with Dr. Robert Bacher and John Ostrom. They started to see the similarity to dinosaurs and birds in dinosaur skeletons very quickly, especially with the skeleton Deinonychus, which is a great dinosaur. And so their theories on dinosaurs and birds really started to implement the dinosaur revolution age, which is about 1969 when dinosaurs and birds really started to get steam. About 1990s was when the very first feathers started to appear in fossils. This was around Liaoning, China, and some really incredible sediments that are full of volcanic ash. And volcanic ash is a wonderful sediment to preserve fine sediments, to preserve feathers and things like that, soft tissues. And so the very first dinosaur feathers started to appear in mudstones. And that just added to our proof that the dinosaurs really are directly related to birds. Their skeletons are exactly alike. And we've got fossils of the feathers right on the fossils themselves, so we know that they were feathered. T-Rex is one of those guys that we call an avian theropod that has very good integument structures on his head that are all quills. So which is kind of funny because birds appeared after dinosaurs. The feathers appeared later. The ones that you would call feather that are fluffy, that helps a bird fly, Those appeared about 30 million years after dinosaurs started to appear with quills like this. So when you think of it, feathers are actually a dinosaur thing first, and then a bird thing.
So, but different kind of feathers. I'd heard that before, and it just never made sense to me, but they're different kinds than what we see today, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
I got it. We had a question come in from...
Yeah, absolutely. So the feathers...
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
We had a question come in from Vernon. They wanted to ask a little bit more about the use of water in getting the bones out, both in the field and in the lab.
Okay. Well, as a paleontologist, we hate water, which, the farmers around here love the water. So we've got a little bit of a fight there. But with water, it is very damaging to bones. So we typically never use water on specimens. And it also makes the clays very, very muddy. So when the clays are muddy, it's very, very hard to dig. When water soaks into bone, something kind of interesting happens too. It starts to make the bone expand and contract, and so that can crack and destroy the bones. So water is definitely not something we use very often. One of the chemicals that we do use is alcohol, or even a chemical called acetone, which evaporates very, very quickly. So it doesn't have time to actually soak into the bone and cause any damage. So those are some of the things that we do use to clean the bones. But water is more damaging than you would think.
Great, thank you. We're getting short on time. Couple of rapid-fire questions. Hardest part of your job?
Okay. Say that again?
The hardest part of your job?
Oh, man, the hardest part of my job is having to pack up from the dig site and come in. That is definitely the hardest part. When you're out at the dig sites and there is not another person around you for 20 square miles, you can hear the coyotes and all the incredible, wonderful sounds of nature. It's very difficult to come back into the city. But the fun part, though, is coming back and unwrapping the bones and seeing what you found that day. But definitely it's hard to... grow up, I would think, when you're a kid in this job.
Coolest thing you have found?
Coolest thing that I found? Definitely these Dimetrodon skeletons are quite spectacular. When you find a fossil, it can be just a scrap of bone or a whole skeleton. When you realize that you're the very first human being to ever see that fossil, that bone, the first time anybody's ever seen that animal, it's a moving experience. You are seeing something that no other living human being has ever seen before. So everything we find is really moving and spectacular. On the aesthetic appearance of things, big complete skeletons like Dimetrodon are just quite stunning and a lot of fun to find.
It's really nice to listen to you talk. A couple of times you've referred to bones, especially ones that are right next to you, or specific animals, and you speak so lovingly about them. It's really nice to hear. This is a partnership with the Kemp Center for the Arts. Could you give us a comment on art and science?
You bet. So, really paleontology started with art. It started off with somebody finding a bone, not knowing what it is, drawing a painting of it on a cave wall. Look at the cave art with woolly mammoths and things like that. It was proof that some of these humans had seen some of these animals. Without these type of picture drawings that these old tribes had created, we wouldn't ever have guessed that these people had seen some of these extinct animals that we see today. So we fast forward to modern age. Drawing definitely helps us to render what we think animals look like, what we think evolutionarily the ecosystems have been doing over the course of 200 million years. It helps us paint that picture, literally, of the ancient history.
Well, we've only had a speck of time, about 45 minutes in comparison to the hundreds of millions of years that you've been talking about. But tell us again, share information about the Whiteside Museum. Where is it? Open times, things like that.
You bet. So the Whiteside Museum is right downtown Seymour. You can't get lost in Seymour. It's right across the street from the water tower. But you see the huge building with beautiful dinosaur murals on the side. We're open every day of the week except Mondays, and the times are 10 to 4. And we're more than happy to give you guys a personal tour anytime you come into the museum. We're really proud to have the prep lab that's available to the public. This is one of the only prep labs in the U.S. that is public friendly. You can walk in, use the microscopes, things like that. So if there's something you want to bring from home to look at under the microscope, you can do that anytime you want. Just come on in. But we're happy to have you anytime for a tour or stuff like that. So
we sure do appreciate your time and your passion, sir.
It's my pleasure, always.
Well, thank you very much for sharing your time with us and telling us how our imaginations can run wild with what we find. We thank you for joining us on this virtual tour, with special thanks to KFDX for making this possible. Join us again next year as we explore how art and history have much to tell. And thanks on behalf of Region 9 for the Kemp Center for the Arts as well. Thanks again. Have a great day.